Hello and welcome back for the Art Camp 3 Week 11 critique. So we are almost there. One more week after this, and we can wrap up this course. So just like last week, we're going to do some more finished painting critiques. So obviously, I know that 2 weeks even is not a lot of time to finish a piece, especially if you have a life or anything like it. So I understand that a lot of these won't be as finished as some of you might want them to be, and I totally understand. I'm going to do my best to still critique them as if they were finished or are going to finish, and try to be as helpful as possible with doing that. So as usual, if you guys have any questions, let me know in the YouTube chat. I'll do my best to watch it. And other than that, I think we're just going to dive straight in and start doing some paint overs. All right. So let me make sure I got my chat on here. And yeah. All right. So just going to go ahead and get in there. So this is off to a good start. I really like the colors here. And you've done a much better job of kind of pushing this more towards a finish. So that's good to see. I think the thing right now is the biggest thing I'm seeing, aside from generally a lack of rendering, is the perspective is being thrown off here, just in how you're painting. You have to be really careful with your mark making and your edges to be able to show the perspective. Because right now, this mountain looks like a hill that's really close to this, and that happens just because of the way that you're doing your brushwork here. There doesn't seem to be a clear separation between this foreground and this background, so you don't really get much of that distance that we want to see in something like this. You want to make sure that your forms are getting smaller, that you're implying some things, and you've also got some clear edges where things are very clearly ahead of others. So part of what's happening over here is the fact that this is bleeding kind of off into this means that that's kind of reducing the scale of things because these aren't that far apart. So therefore, if this base is going to be going down in one swooping line to the background, it's going to reduce the distance of all that stuff. So over here and show kind of what I'm talking about here and how you need that clear separation of background and foreground and midground. If you want to get as much depth out of a piece as I think you do. I will say again, though, that I do really like the colors on this one. I think you doing a quite good job. You've got some really nice warms and cools going on, and I think those are working pretty well. I think if you're going to have kind of this explosion stuff going on in there, try to play up the lighting and how that's going to affect everything in the scene. You can kind of exaggerate it. Obviously during daytime, explosions might not have a ton of effect on the lighting, just because sunlight is so bright. But it's at least worth thinking about. Be really clear and deliberate about this foreground and separating it from the background. So we make sure we get that split in that distance there. So this is another case where putting down a perspective grid would probably really help if you haven't already. It'll just help you with doing kind of what I'm doing now, but have an easier time visualizing exactly what you're doing. Have an easier time visualizing just how these forms are going to recede back there and how to make them look like they're really far away. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the main thing that I was seeing with this. Overall, it obviously needs more rendering, but in general, I think it's headed in the right direction. I like some of the stuff happening up here, like I like this little swoopy line and stuff, and I think you've got the indications of some really cool stuff going on. I just do want to see this like really, really rendered and pushed even further because uh, I do like the starting direction here. So yeah, just kind of keep going with it. I think your values are good, your colors are good, your composition's pretty solid. It just kind of needs to be taken that next step further. Right, this is looking really good. Um, you definitely took the advice from last week and have made this a lot more interesting, which is good to see. Um, I like most of it. Uh, really, the only mm, yeah, you've added lots of nice little interesting details, lots of cool forms. I'd say actually what is bothering me the most about this is perhaps the extreme foreground as well as some of the smallest details. So, like, what I'm talking about is sort of the individual raindrops plus these really spindly lines. And now there's nothing wrong with having that level of detail and that size of detail, but it has to mesh with the rest of the stuff you're doing everywhere else. And right now, you've sort of established a certain size of detail, a certain sort of fidelity of detail. Um, Based on the sizes and types of brushes you've been using everywhere else. And these kind of marks go a little bit against that because they're just too small and they're too detailed. And so they don't quite jive with the rest of it. Um, so I'd be careful with that. Also, be careful that you're getting too regular with things. For instance, these raindrops, you kind of want to avoid the individual raindrop look. You more want to get the effect of it, which is sort of most of what you're doing back here with this kind of misting effect, where it's just kind of hitting the top of these forms and stuff and kind of almost adding a little bit of a mist to things. Because there's already enough indications in your painting of what's happening that we don't need those extra details to be able to identify that it's raining. It's pretty obvious. And so now we get to be a little bit more subtle with it and instead just kind of rely on almost a bit of a silhouetting kind of fog effect to the silhouettes that we've got. Um, so the other thing I'm going to say is the extreme foreground area. I don't feel is quite working as strongly as I think you want it to. Um, Partially, I think this tree isn't quite reading like I want it to. I think for the size you've got here and the perspective you've established, I think you could go a little more extreme with it. Right now, it feels a bit too tentative. So I actually want to bring the scope of this in a little bit. Actually, see bit more of it. Round that thing out a little bit more. Bring it even closer to camera. I think that'll add just a touch more depth than you've got here. Um, and then probably actually cover up some of it with some of these other kind of plants and flowers and stuff like that here in the foreground. I think you can get away with some of that. The other thing I'd be careful about is it's getting a little too monotone. You've got some good indications of red, but I want to see maybe one or two of them kicked up just a little bit. Perhaps these foreground ones even. Not a lot because you don't want to overdo the piece, but even just upping the value that much, pumping up the saturation ever so slightly, making them a little bit more notably red, I think might be enough to make it a little bit more interesting. You could also play with some of your grays and subtly adding in some other color tones in them. That can be kind of a fun thing when I find that my piece is getting a little too monochrome. So go in there with some different blues and just like this, just very, very, very gently, almost no opacity, start to add that kind of hue variety back in there. It can be a nice, refreshing thing if a scene is getting too gray or even too monotone of any color to add in some hue variety like that. You can kind of get away with anything when it comes to hues. So it's sort of, it can often, from what I've seen, create kind of a more pleasing sense to the eye to have that bit of variety. I'm obviously a big fan of grays in my paintings, but if you really, really look close at a lot of the grays, there's a surprising amount of hue variety in a lot of those. Um, so it's something to consider. You don't have to do this, and you certainly don't have to go overboard with it. Honestly, I would probably do all that I've just done on a different layer and then drop it down to like 40% opacity so that it's really subtle, but it'll just add a little bit of sparkle to your painting that I think it could use. Um, but overall, I'm really impressed. I think you've done a really good job. You've taken a lot of this stuff to heart, and you really have pushed a piece to a very nice level of finish. So yeah, I'm happy. This looks really good. Right. Good. Um, yeah, this is looking good so far. There's a couple things I want to say on this. Um, First of all, I'm not really buying the perspective. I think you need a little more indication on the ground of exactly how the perspective is working. You need some more indications of just with your brushwork, with your details, with some of your overlaps, to show us a little tighter exactly what's happening with the perspective, so that we know the scale of these things. Because in some sense, these two figures look like they're pretty far distant. Yet when you actually look at the figures, they're about the same size. So I'm a little confused on that perspective. I feel like this guy either needs to be bigger or this guy needs to be smaller. 'Cause my first impression when I first glanced at this is there's something off with the perspective, and the figures are certainly adding to that. I don't know that that's the only problem, but obviously I think just upping the size of one of them uh, could really change this piece, and I think bring it into a little bit more correct perspective, as well as the stuff with the ground. I think you kind of need both of those, um, because honestly, if I look at this and I actually just take out this figure here, the perspective seems to already work a lot better just by doing that. So with that in mind, uh, yeah, just kind of make up your mind which way you want to go with that. But certainly keep it in mind. You've got to keep in mind that you are implying a fair bit of distance between this level here and back here, and you're not really showing us that distance when it comes to the figures. So there's a little bit of confusion there. The other thing I want to say is that your colors overall are quite good, but I think they're working very well over here and not quite as great here. Um, right over here, they feel a little too digital, like too many layers of overlay have happened, which is probably the case, and that's fine if that's the case. But it's just a sign that at this point you need to go back in and hand paint some stuff and hand pick some colors, because right now they're feeling a little too artificial. You can get that when you're using like lighten layers, overlay layers, soft light layers, stuff like that, and you're using them too much almost uh, and not carefully enough. You can start to get a feel that things are flattening out and the colors aren't really defining any forms. This is part of the problem with photo textures and photo work of any kind, is that it's very easy to get locked into the photos and start to forget all the other stuff we've learned with, thinking about the forms, painting the forms, thinking about the values, making sure we have solid values, describing all the forms, and instead focus on all the nice detail work that photos give us. So I think I'd say for you to probably take a step back with this background and get back to that value stage of, okay, what exactly am I trying to show here in this background? How am I going to do that with, good values, simple colors? And then once you get to this, then you can kind of go back in there with some of the photo textures you've got and start to work back in there and uh, with paying a lot of attention to maintaining the value structure you set up in this stage. Um, so making sure that your photos that you're putting on there, or your texture brushes or anything like that, are a subtle enough value difference from what you've got that they don't start screwing up structure you've already built back there. As usual, I think the water should be a little bit darker in most places. Um, Yeah, just a few thoughts there. I really like where this is going. I think overall, I do like the colors. It's just that the colors in this portion weren't that strong, and there's a little bit of wonkiness with the perspective. But overall, I think it's pretty solid and definitely off to a good start. And yeah, I think that's about all I have to say on that one. So it's looking good. All right, it's looking good. This is a good improvement on last week. Um, feels feels a lot better. Has some good, solid focal points. Um, yeah. Now, I'm gonna try to figure something out. I think the lighting doesn't quite work for me. I'm trying to figure out exactly why. I have a feeling it's too bright. Could also be something to do with the brush work, perhaps the way it's kind of receding off there. That it maybe as it gets further away, it needs to get darker. Figure out exactly what it is. There's something bothering me about kind of how the light is working in there. Really, my easiest way of figuring out what is not quite working about a piece is to actually do the paint over. I just kind of look at it, treat it like it's something that I'm working on. Think about, okay, there's the not quite working right now. What am I going to do to make that be a little bit stronger? Yeah, I think a lot of that is actually toning down some of the light there. And then actually paying a bit more attention to darkening some of your shadows here. Kind of establish the right value range for the sort of daylight portion of it. Because obviously most of the scene is being lit by this daylight, and then there's a secondary light source here. And we didn't talk about secondary light sources too much, and maybe that would be a good supplement at some point, is to talk about how to balance good secondary light source with the ones we find in landscapes. I'd also be careful with your edges. I think a lot of them are getting too sharp. I think it's because they don't jive with how soft a lot of the other parts of the piece are. That they're just so crisp. They're really really tight, hard, crisp edges, and then you've got a lot of really nice soft painterly stuff, and you kind of need to decide one way or the other. Um, Not totally. Obviously, you can have hard and soft edges in the same piece, but they need to be sort of in the same world rather than so far apart that it suddenly looks kind of cut out in places. Um, so do be careful about that. Yeah, I think actually just toning down the values there. Suddenly, this feels a little bit more like a soft glow in there rather than kind of what was going on before that felt a bit out of place. Um, Overall, I do really like your colors. I think you've got a nice variety of different greens in here, a nice variety of different grays, and I really like this sense of light. You can really feel the luminous sense of the atmosphere back here. I think that's working great. Your perspective is a little bit off here, I think. I think this path would widen a little bit more as it gets closer to us. I have to put down a perspective grid to be 100% certain, but I would say that based on my gut instinct, I think this would get a little larger. Um, the other thing I would say is that do be careful about the size of your mark making for grass. Be careful about this sort of, kind of stippling effect of just kind of hashing out little marks for the grass. It can be very easy to get extremely regular with that and lose the sense of kind of nature to it and lose the sense of um, perspective as well and the different forms of it. So you almost want to think about grass like clumping. Um, Not specifically clumping, but you do want to accentuate certain ones a little bit more. Have some areas that are a little bit flatter in tone. Yeah, grass is a tricky one, and hand painting it is always a pain. But I would be a little bit more careful with that. Um, Go forward with that. Um, yeah, overall, I think it's looking really good. Um, there's obviously some more tightening work you can do. I like the little bit of photo that you snuck in there. I think that's actually working pretty well. It's a little bit tough because if you do start to do this, you kind of need to keep doing it. I'm pretty sure I talked about it a fair bit in the video that um, the whole piece needs to sort of speak the same language and have the same sort of family of detail. So if you go really, really painterly with one area of your painting, you can't really get away with doing photo real for another part of your painting. Balancing those two things is really tricky, and it's usually best to kind of have a similar level of detail for most of the piece. Not necessarily similar level of detail, I guess, but rather just kind of the same range of detail. If you've got a 1 and a 10 for detail, you can't have a 1 and a 10 in the same piece, but you can have a 1 and a 5 maybe. Things can get pretty tight and pretty painterly, or they can get really tight and pretty tight. So think about that. Think about making sure that things are kind of jiving with that. You've got some rocks here that are obviously quite painterly, and I think that if you're going to have this back here of photo texture, this is going to feel out of place. So think about how you're going to do that, how you're going to balance things. And that could just mean going back in here and painting over some more of the photo stuff like you've done and simplifying it even further just to make sure it doesn't stand out too much. But looking good. Right. Good. Getting a really good sense of light here, which is really good to see. Um, yeah, there's a lot of strong stuff happening with the light. Um, there's a few things that I think are making this not quite as strong as I think it could be. I'm trying to figure out exactly what those are. For one thing, I think some of the values are a bit too prominent. We talked about it before when we talked about forest and building value structures for forest, that you need to play up the atmospheric perspective more than nature, because when we're in a forest, we see with our stereoscopic vision, and we get that three-dimensional effect just by looking around us. Whereas when you're looking at a painting, you don't get that effect. So you have to really, really play up the atmosphere, probably more than you think you do. Just kind of flipping that on and off. It starts to have a little bit more depth to it. before, I feel like these things back here, they were so dark in value in spots that they were kind of rivaling almost the foreground and flattening out the piece because of that. So be really careful about that. Um, the other thing, I think, uh, you want to be pretty specific with your foreground and how it's becoming your background. That is, you want to be pretty clear about these overlaps here. Of okay, if this is maybe kind of receding back in here, you want to be clear and maybe add in a few indications of that. I'm kind of going overboard to sort of show what I mean, but you want these little indications so that we can kind of see exactly what's happening, because this is sort of along the right lines, but it doesn't. We don't get a really clear sense of how these hills and mounds or shrubs and stuff are exactly receding, and so there's a bit of confusion. We know there's a separation between here and here, but we don't exactly know how it works right now. We don't exactly know how these things are receding. So almost go back in there with maybe some lines and really figure it out. Same sort of goes for this area here. Not quite buying it. There's not enough sort of solid drawing here, and obviously when you're doing it with something that's painterly, it's pretty easy to kind of slack off on the drawing aspect of things. But do be careful about that. The tree overall looks quite good. It's a little bit uniform, and I might like to see a little bit more interest in it. Um, and I don't think you have quite enough perspective going on with it. I'm not getting enough of a sense of this wrapping around. And that comes partially from you're a little too tentative with how much uh, you're going to be seeing the very, very ends of this. And these forms are going to get really tiny as you get to the side. And you've only gotten kind of tiny. Um, you've sort of gone halfway to showing us that these things are really, really receding. But when you go out and look at a tree, you'll notice that the edge of the bark really, really wraps around there. At that last little bit, you see some sides of the tree that are really, really edge on, that you just barely catch a glimpse of, even more so than you've got. So think about that. Think about rounding that out just a little bit more. I like your focal point. I think it looks really good. Your colors are super sweet. Sense of lighting is great. I love this orange light coming through the green. Looks fantastic. Overall, yeah, looks really good. You could tighten it up more. That's pretty much the only thing I would say to it. I think it could use with being a little bit tighter. But that's about all. Overall, I think it looks really nice in there. Um, could just potentially use with a bit of tightening. Um, yeah, your value work is really nice. Your colors are great. Still like the composition, has a nice balance to it. Uh, just a just a few little tweaks here and there, and yeah, I think you'd have a really nice portfolio piece here. This looks really good. Right, looks good. Um, let's see here. I feel like there's some wonkiness with the perspective. So based on back here, I'm kind of getting an indication that the horizon line is right around here, which works for the most part. It works for the figure, which is part of the reason I think it is right around there. It works with the landscape back here. It doesn't quite work with the tiger dude here, because you can see so much of the top of him. Whereas if the horizon line is there, you're not going to see much of any of the top of him. You're going to see mostly side. And so getting his roundness is super important. So just a quick thought there on the perspective and making sure these things line up. It can often be hard, especially when you're dealing with different references and stuff, to get it all to line up. But like I mentioned in one of my videos, you want to kind of hang everything on the same horizon line. And if you do that, you kind of can't go too wrong with the perspective. So think about that a bit. The lighting right now isn't super exciting for what you've got, and it seems like it has every potential to be really cool. Um, so I think you could just kind of do with a bit more dappled light effects. You can go a little bit more all out, have some areas that are highly illuminated. Part of the joys of doing a jungle scene like this is that you get to literally play up everything and have light wherever you want it, have shadows wherever you want it, and to play with it as much as possible. Another thing to think about is be careful when you're doing something this warm color in this green of an environment. Keep in mind that light bounces all around and colors sort of bleed everywhere, uh, just because that's the way light kind of works. So there's going to be a lot of green light bouncing around in these shadows. So make sure you're getting enough green into the skin tones to balance them out. So she's going to go actually a little bit more gray because of how much green is in here. You might even have some areas that are just flat out green, um, just to kind of tie her in with everything else that's going on here. And you can do likewise by adding in a little bit more warmth around here. Maybe some of the branches and stuff have a bit more warmth in there, just so they start to feel like part of the same world. Because part of the thing I was seeing is that they were feeling a little disconnected from everything, and perspective was part of that. That I feel like this guy wasn't quite sitting right in perspective, um, just based on the form there. And I think the other thing is that the colors weren't quite feeling natural for it. Um, Also, be careful about doing the covering up the feet and hands thing. You want to make sure that you're not doing that too often, just because people do tend to do it and people do tend to notice. Um, Another thing over here, and sort of here to some degree, is that you've done this nice like foliage and trees and stuff like that, but it's almost like you've painted a flat surface of leaves, and you've sort of forgotten that they actually do come towards us in perspective. So think about maybe sketching one or more that are actually going to come at us. If that makes sense. Don't forget to draw kind of in 3 dimensions. Make sure all this stuff is not just kind of flattening out. It's very, very easy to do, and it's very easy to think too much about colors and think too much about lighting and forget that drawing stage, which is kind of why I will often have to go back to that drawing stage and to remind myself of what's happening here, what do I need to focus on, and how can I get that to feel a little bit more solid. Um, yeah, so a lot of scattered thoughts there, but I think they might help you as you take this to finish. All right, this is looking good. Excuse me. Ooh, too much talking. All right. Um, my initial impression, I do really like the colors. That's the first thing I'll say. But there's something kind of feeling a little bit odd about the perspective, in that I feel like there's not perspective exactly. It feels like a lot of flat, perspectiveless items sort of put together. Uh, and so that can come about in that I don't feel like there's a lot of seating going on here. I'm not getting enough sense of overlap here. I'm not getting enough sense of objects getting smaller. Like when you look at some of the tombs back here, or gravestones back here, they're about the same size. They're not that different. There's a little bit of change there, but not too much. Not enough that it looks like it's working. I also can't exactly tell where the horizon line is. If it's down here, um, we would be looking up at things a whole lot more. We wouldn't see so many of these stairs, especially up here. They're all going to get really dark because we're just going to be seeing the sides of them. I don't get a sense of perspective on any of the trees. There's basically just a lot of areas where I don't really have a strong sense of perspective, and there's enough of that I would be concerned. So if you establish the horizon line here, you want to be really definite about that, and then we start to understand things differently. So if we see all these trees back here, we start to think, okay, well, these are going to have to be going up this mountain to be able to see them because they're above us. So that's the only way that would work. um, this ground plane is going to have to be really chiseled out and defined. When you look at a tree like this, don't just think about kind of a Bob Ross tree of infinite perspective. You're infinitely far away from it, so it's all the same perspective. Think about, okay, just like we've talked about, like, okay, if this is below the horizon line, I'm going to have some stuff wrapping around that way. And then as it gets above the horizon line, and maybe as it comes towards me or away from me, these things are going to be wrapping around, and all of this is going to have a solid sense of form. And even those indications will be very small. They are extremely important for getting your point across and for making sure that all of this reads. It can be easy to let that stuff sort of slide, but it is incredibly important. Um, the last thing I sort of want to say is that, when you're doing architecture, get a lot of reference, because architecture is super hard, and painting it without tons of reference is almost impossible. Unless you have done a million buildings on your own without any reference, constructing them from your head is really, really difficult. And unfortunately, unlike a lot of things in art, they are going to stand out like a sore thumb. It's kind of like someone not extremely experienced with figures, doing a figure painting without any reference. You're probably going to very obviously tell, and even laymen, for lack of a better term, are going to be able to obviously tell that something is not referenced. So think about that, and be careful about that. Um, so yeah, uh, so there's just a few thoughts, and of course on top of that, this isn't obviously finished in the sense of it would take a lot more rendering to get there, but I certainly think you could. So yeah, but looking good. Again, I really do like the colors. It's an interesting color palette. It's not one you see very often, and I think it could work pretty well. Just right now, I think there's some sort of fundamental stuff with just constructing a value image that I don't think are working extremely well here. Um, so just a thought. All right, it's looking good. We've got some really nice colors here. I really like your value work, especially when you've got these nice lights and darks. Um, this is working. It's working quite well. I think something not quite working for me. Trying to figure out what it is. I think it could be that some of the sky is perhaps getting a little too dark. Yeah, I have a feeling that actually this needs to get brightened up a little bit to bring it all into alignment with the piece. And it's really, really hard to just kind of eyeball the correct value for skies and stuff, but it is something that comes with time and lots of reference. But it's something that I feel here is not quite bright enough. Um, The other thing is that with this sort of lighting, with these nice pools of light that are really, really pretty, you're going to get some of that warmth even in the um, even in the sky, and you get some of that sort of pooling of light even up there, as you're going to probably have multiple layers of clouds and stuff. So you might have some that are actually a little bit in shadow. Be kind of a nice thing to see. Overall, it's looking really good though. Foreground obviously is not, I think, quite as rendered as the rest, which is part of the reason I think it's falling a little bit short. Um, Perspective wise, you've got kind of the start here of what the perspective is doing there, which is good. It flattens out a little bit on this side, so as you're rendering more, make sure that you are getting enough of this feeling of looking up. There's also the problem of, if you want it to feel a little bit more natural, you have to kind of start to think about the rock structures. So right now you've got sort of established look of vertical forms here. So you might want to go vertical here as well. Also, things in nature tend to taper. It's pretty rare for something to stick out. It's in fact extremely rare, and so you kind of want things to taper, almost like a tree trunk would. There's a reason that things tend to do that. It'll just feel a little bit more natural if they do. It's very hard for something like that to withstand, decades or centuries or millennia of wear and tear and still form like that. So it happens occasionally, but just in general, be careful and mindful of that. The things will tend to taper in a more or less continuous fashion. Another thing I want to say is, do be careful about your rendering detail and your sort of fidelity of detail that I've been talking about. That you've got a lot of tiny brushstrokes here, and they're sort of distracting the eye too much. Because right now you've got this really nice, smooth, nice value transition, and then you've got kind of this more rough stuff going on back here, and that might be partly from the fact that it's not quite as finished as you might like. But it's something to think about as you're finishing it, to make sure that that detail and the amount of small details are in good relation to one another. So you can have a lot of details back there, but keep in mind they're probably going to be less detailed back here than they will be here. And so these little tiny brush strokes and stuff will distract the eye. And same goes for here. You're going to want to soften out and reduce some of the detail back there, and bring some of those values a little bit closer together, so they don't distract us quite as much. I like the statue. Um, do be careful with obviously painting on a different layer, in that at the end of the day, you're going to want to be very careful about this edge, and you're going to want to make sure it's soft or hard as it needs to be. Um, Also be careful about getting too dark. It's quite a lot darker than everything else around it. So I would be careful about that. Something that large is going to have a lot of light hitting it. Also be careful about your perspective. I know I'm going to harp on this a million times, but when you are looking up at a figure like this, you're not going to see the top of much of his shoulder. You're going to, the shoulder is actually going to come up, and you're going to see mostly the side of his shoulder, especially if it's, formed like that. So be careful about that. If you don't already have reference, get more reference. Uh, think about that. That's most of what I have to say. Uh, oh, also the lighting direction doesn't quite line up to the sky. That might be the other thing. Is this sort of lighting looks like it's sort of straight on, whereas everything else that you've established is, I believe, from the left, just based on, like this mountain here. These have sort of established this kind of left direction lighting. And then you've got more or less kind of a right direction lighting here, because otherwise the shadows would be on the other side, which might be the other thing that I'm getting with the disconnect between the sky and the ground. We're feeling a little out of balance. between the two. You might also benefit from a little bit more warmth up there. You've got a lot of cool colors up there and not a lot of warmth, and so it might be nice to bring in a touch of those grays into that sky area. So yeah, a lot of different thoughts there, but it's looking good. I do like the overall sense of lighting here. I think you're heading in a good direction here. All right. I remember seeing this one in the chat. This looks good. It's really good. I think my sort of thought on this is actually one of values, and it's not that the values are all that wrong right now. It's just I think they could be stronger to emphasize um, the painting itself. Um, I'll play for a second here and see. I think you could de-emphasize a lot of what's going on around him. The sign, even though I know the sign is important, because I kind of like that almost as a second read. This way, you'll kind of let his eyes pop out and be the sort of prominent focal points. I think it's kind of the most effective way to do it. And some nice dark darks in here. The other thing is your value range is a lot less than I think you could make it. You can get a fair bit darker than you're doing. And that might be a case of your monitor or something. But there are a number of values lower than what you're doing that you can make, you can take advantage of. Same goes for like this sign over here. I think it's one of those things that's not quite as important. It doesn't really have to happen. To wonder about making use of this whole right side somehow. You might, for instance, populate it somewhat. Um, Obviously, with the size of the figures, they're going to be pretty tiny, but it might be nice to have a few kind of hanging out over here just for scale. You could bring a few foreground ones, but I think that might be kind of nice to sort of activate this space over here, make something for us to look at, and maybe give a little bit of scale to this. Because obviously we see the figures in there, but we might not immediately make that connection unless suddenly we have a few foreground guys here giving us some sort of context for this scene. Um, Sort of same goes again for the background here. I almost want more of this nicely silhouetted here. I'm all about making sure that your focal point is reading better than everything else and subduing stuff that's not quite as important as others. So even though your values are more or less correct around here, I think emphasizing what's really important about this scene and making sure that he pops the right amount is pretty important. So it's mostly a case of just kind of values and limiting detail to where we really want to look. Um, so yeah, I think this looks really good. Super sweet piece. It's very cool. It's a good idea. Um, yeah, it might be nice to potentially see some other form of like loading bays or loading stairs or something like that. Because if we're loading from up here, maybe you could have the figures standing up here. If on the other hand you're loading from down here, because there's a nice sign here and stuff, maybe you've got a couple stairways or something like that, or ramps, little movable ramps that are along here. Something to make it obvious that we can get into this thing, just for more added storytelling aspect to it, because that's obviously pretty important for a piece like this. But looks good. It's a fun piece. All right, this looks really good. A lot of really nice colors to it. Really solid values. I love the separation of things. Um, I have a feeling you're going to know what I'm about to say, but I feel like the perspective is kind of weak right now. Um, I think it's a very solvable problem, but right now I'm not getting a strong sense of perspective depth here, which is really a shame because the values and the concept are telling me there's a ton of depth and there's a ton of scale. Um, so I think there's a couple of solutions here. So one is that, all right, so let's say we have this thing, so it's growing towards us on the right, which I think it kind of is because it does look a little bit lower on the left. So play that up and allow yourself to have a couple things here in the foreground that are getting closer to us and maybe even overshadowing and casting a bit of shadow here on the right. And then allow this left side to actually recede and diminish and get further away from us. We get some sort of sense of scope of this because the problem is it almost looks like a wall of clouds, which doesn't communicate as much scale as I think you want to. Um, so I think even just that is probably enough to start to get the idea of it. Um, the other thing I would probably say is I think you could benefit from, for one thing, I think a little bit less balance. I don't like how there's a shrub in each corner. That's partially personal preference, but I also don't think you really need them. You can have one of them if you really want, but I don't think you need both. Both just feels like it's trying too hard to be balanced, trying too hard to be scared of corners. Artists are always really terrified of corners. They're always super paranoid of the corners of their painting that they always think they're have to put something there so that people don't, I don't know, look over there or something. Uh, I don't know why this happens, but it's a pretty common thing. But I kind of want to see just a touch more depth here in the foreground. Maybe like a couple hoof prints of him. It might be kind of cool. Have a couple little footprints here in the foreground. Maybe he's walked back there or something. Uh, maybe just a little bit more depth in there. I would like to see a bit more shadow maybe here on the right. I really like the subtlety you're getting here in these distant mountains, though. I think that's working great, and I want to make sure you're keeping that. Yeah, I think it's mostly a case of just kind of a drawing issue with pushing that perspective, making sure that your linear perspective is working as strong as the rest of your perspective because your values are really strong and your details are really good. Your painting skills are very good. All the stuff is working quite well. I just think it's a case of the drawing stage is sort of holding you back compared to everything else. But all right, it does look really good though. I'm excited about this one. Right. So obviously just a sketch, so not as far along as we're trying to do, but that's fine. Um, my initial impression is sort of the problem I mentioned before of same-sized objects everywhere. You're breaking up all the shapes into the same size in sort of a similar shape even, which obviously repeating shape language is fine, but you do want to be careful about just sort of repeating the same shape everywhere because it just kind of feels like a tiled background at some point. Um, the other thing is that the color's looking good. I don't really have a sense at all right now of the perspective because right now I don't have any feel that it's here or even here because I feel like I'm looking at everything at the same point. Everything it looks like I'm just kind of looking at it straight on. Everything is in perfect profile, which there's nothing wrong with that sort of abstract, overly zoomed in kind of perspective. It can work, but it is definitely a stylistic choice you want to be careful with because removing perspective from landscapes is a very dangerous move, especially if it's a landscape meant to sit on its own. It's one thing if you're looking at a background for an animation and have kind of no perspective in there, but you want to make sure that if you're trying to do landscapes for their own, that you do have some strong sense of perspective, some strong sense of depth to the piece. It's sort of one of the trademarks of good landscape design. So yeah, just a couple things to think about. Obviously, not too much I can go into here, just because it is a sketch phase right now, and there's a lot of different directions you could go with it now. But there's certainly some promise here. There's some good colors here. There's some good values here. Um, just like to see it push to finish. It looks really good. Really like the colors. Colors are looking gorgeous. Um, right now, my initial impression is okay. This is a good start, but where's the payoff? What is this image about? I'm looking at this, and yes, this is sort of it kind of a depression in the earth. It's got some rocks and trees and stuff, and it's looking good. The colors are good. The lighting is starting to be good, but I'm not getting a sense of okay. So what's this painting about? Is it feels like there's a backdrop here, and then you turned off the layer where you've got a focal point here, where you've got something happening, where you've got some scenes, you've got some figures going on, you've got some creatures, you've got something going on, some sort of focal point. Because right now you've got kind of this as your focal point, and then all this sort of ends up going into kind of a gray. When you start to zoom out, it doesn't really have much going on in most of the painting. And I'm okay with subtle. In fact, a big fan of doing really, really subtle stuff like that. But I think you've gone a little too far and need to get back to the stage of really looking closely at making sure you've got those focal points in there. Make sure you have as many as three focal points in a piece. Because right now your colors, your painting, your shapes, they're all looking quite good, um, and they're off to a really good start here. But it needs that focal point payoff. I need something to really look at. And unfortunately, most of the time, sort of having an indication of a sunset isn't quite enough. You need a little bit more. You need some sort of secondary payoff. Um, so, with that in mind, I think this is all definitely going well so far. Um, as usual, I'd like to see a little stronger perspective, a little stronger indication that we're looking up at this stuff. So yeah, you've got everything receding in there in a 3-point perspective, but as you render this, make sure that even your brush strokes are indicating this three-dimensional form, are showing this wrapping around. Make sure those rocks, you're seeing the correct amount of the top of them as opposed to the bottom of them, underside, the side planes. Make sure all that stuff is working as solidly as possible, so that this can work as well as we want it to. So yeah, it's looking good. Right. And this one, yeah, this looks good. Um, this is looking good. This is an improvement from before. Um, hmm. Let's see here. I think for this one, it's one of those. Always look at the values and see if this is working as well as you want it to. So for this image, the clear focal point is right smack dab there. That is super obviously the focal point. It's hard to deny that. But if you think about that and then you look at it abstractly in terms of values, feels like this light over here is distracting slightly from it. So that's a case where I would tone down the secondary thing a little bit. Next, I would think about okay, so what's the secondary focal point to this? Is it going to be one of these columns here? Is it going to be um, something back here in these mountains back here? I'm not really sure. It could be just about anything. But I'm not really getting a second read here because I immediately look at the image and I understand it, and that's really good because you do want to be able to just look at it and understand it and get it. But then you need that second read of, okay, so what's this image about? Maybe, make these columns a little bit more interesting. If they're columns, they're going to have some sort of base to them. You could add some decorative flourish to them. You could add some stuff going on there. You could add some more architecture besides just a few random columns. You could have the other parts of the columns broken off here. Maybe it's toppled over if it's broken, and you've actually got some remains of that kind of growing along here, some moss growing on top of it, stuff like that. Start getting into the story of what's happening here. Make us really, really wonder about what's happening here. And as far as rendering goes, if you are going to do a tight focal point like this, that is super obviously the focal point, go ahead and zoom in and get this just right. So for instance, you've got some light coming in from the left, illuminating the side of this thing, and that doesn't quite make sense with the rest of the lighting setup you've got. And so actually get in there and make sure that the drawing and stuff uh, right here is really, really good. Take the extra time to really tighten this up and get it just right. And you're going to want to zoom out frequently to make sure you don't detail too much or too little or have some edges that are sort of off. You've got some stray outlines in here that don't quite mesh with how you've painted the rest of the scene. So be careful about that. Um, just start thinking about all these little things and really zoom in and get this just right. Make sure your edges are just right. Paint this on a different layer and really, 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 really tighten up your rendering of that focal point. Because right now I'm getting stronger senses of detail here in the foreground, largely because you've got some photo work here. But that's, again, as I've talked about before, part of the issue with using photos in your pieces is that they establish a precedent for what the viewer is going to expect. And if you're going to use photos at almost 100% opacity, you're going to have an expectation that most of the piece is going to be extremely detailed. And then when you get back here and you're staying kind of loose and painterly and have some stray edges and stray forms, it's not going to work quite as well. It's one thing if the whole piece is like that. It's another thing if you've established this precedent for photorealism. So be really careful with that. It's part of the reason I leave off photos till here at the end, is that they are a trickier thing to balance than most people assume. And bad photo work is the cringiest thing you ever see on ArtStation. It's super obvious to anyone who knows what they're looking for, and it also is something that can be remedied very easily if you do pay attention to it for a while. So I like the way you're painting. I like the way you're working. I like this piece in general. I just think you need to be careful about as you do finished work, making sure that everything is sort of sitting in this same world. I do still caution you about the composition, that I don't feel like abstractly it's as strong as it could be. Just because I do wonder if it needs some more foreground elements. I do wonder if it needs some more layers in here. Sort of the compositional stuff I talked about on this one before. I do wonder if it needs to do that. I'm not exactly sure. I also miss having the figures in there because the figures did add some context to the size of things. Because right now, columns can be just about any size you want. And obviously, these could be large rocks or small rocks. We're not quite sure. Whereas before, when you've had some figures in there, they added much more solid sense of what was happening there, as well as adding an easy bit of storytelling, which I think is kind of nice to see. So just a thought. But yeah, looking good. All right, so pretty short critique today, just an hour. But you guys are doing good stuff. Hopefully, all this stuff was helpful for you. Seems like, as usual, a lot of it is perspective, balancing photo details A lot of you obviously would struggle with that because it is annoying. It's hard to do. It does take a lot of practice. But you've got a lot of really good stuff here. Your color work overall is just all fantastic. I really like what you're all doing with that. So it's really awesome to see. Yeah, I think that'll about do it for today. So thanks for joining. And so we've got another piece to do after this. So we'll be starting our last finished painting. And because I'm trying to be a nice guy, I figure since we've only had 2 weeks for these last two finished pieces, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys 3 weeks to finish this last one. So 3 weeks from today, we will do our final critique and go over all of your last landscape paintings and wrap up this course. So thanks again to all of you, and I will see you all in 3 weeks.